story on the island of the dolls. My name is Ethan, and I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. I grew up in the heart of Chicago, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of city life, and I never really cared about ghost stories or spirits. To me, they were just tales made up to scare impressionable people. That started to change when I decided to take a trip to Mexico to visit a peculiar place I'd heard about in a documentary, the Island of the Dolls in Xochimilco. What I experienced there was one of the most terrifying true horror stories I could have ever imagined. The Island of the Dolls is one of the many small islets that are part of the canal complex in Xochimilco, Mexico City. When I first heard about it, I was intrigued. The place was said to be haunted, filled with dolls hanging from the trees, left there to appease the spirit of a young girl who had tragically died in the waters surrounding the island. I decided I needed to see it with my own eyes, but I could never have predicted what I would actually find. I arrived in Xochimilco on a sunny afternoon and rented one of the boats that take tourists on tours through the canals. The boatman who guided me seemed reluctant when I mentioned the Island of the Dolls, but he didn't say anything, just nodded and carried on. As we got closer, a feeling of unease began to grow inside me. The trees around the island were covered with dirty, damaged dolls, some missing eyes, others missing limbs. It looked like a scene straight out of one of those creepy horror stories people tell around campfires. When I set foot on the island, the boatman insisted I didn't stay long. He spoke little English, but I could tell from the tone of his voice that he was worried. I, however, was determined to explore the place, curious to see if there was any truth to the terrifying real stories that circulated about the island. I walked around the small plot of land, observing the hanging dolls, feeling a chill run down my spine. The place had an oppressive atmosphere, as if something was wrong, something that couldn't be seen, but could definitely be felt. That first night, I decided to camp on the island. Setting up my tent next to all those dolls seemed like an interesting idea, something to tell my friends later. What started as an impulsive and exciting decision quickly turned into an experience I would never forget. As night fell, the silence around me became deafening. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat, a heavy rhythm that seemed to echo throughout the island. Then, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, almost indistinguishable. I thought it was just the wind passing through the trees, but soon I realized the voices were coming from all directions. They seemed to intensify, as if the dolls were trying to communicate, or worse, as if the island itself was whispering ancient secrets, chilling horror tales that no one should hear. With every passing minute, the sound became clearer, more insistent. I tried to ignore the whispers, attributing them to my imagination, but it was impossible. There was something deeply disturbing about that sound, something that seemed to be penetrating my mind, creating a growing sense of dread. I quickly got up, trying to locate the source of the whispers, but there was no one there except me. The dolls seemed to be staring at me, their empty, fixed eyes appearing alive in the dark. I felt a presence around me, a sensation that I was not alone. Then I heard a laugh, a child's laugh, clear as day, coming from somewhere nearby. The sound was so real that it made me freeze inside. I bolted out of the tent, desperate to understand what was happening. As I walked through the island, my flashlight trembling in my hand, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. Among the trees, in the moonlight, I saw a small, frail figure, a girl dressed in old-fashioned clothes, holding a doll in her arms. She stood there, watching me. Terror gripped me, but I had to know. I shouted, asking who she was, but the girl simply turned and disappeared among the trees, leaving only a trail of silence and cold behind. I returned to the tent, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. I sat inside, trying to convince myself that all of it was just an illusion caused by exhaustion and suggestion. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The dolls, which had once seemed like just inanimate objects, now terrified me constantly. The idea of staying there for a few more hours became unbearable, but a morbid curiosity and stubbornness kept me rooted in that place. As the hours dragged on, the environment around the tent became increasingly hostile. The whispers returned, now more intense, and I could swear that some of the dolls had gotten closer to the tent. It was as if they were gathering, as if something was about to happen. Every little gust of wind that rustled the trees seemed to carry a dark secret, a fragment of a story that shouldn't be told. The early hours of the morning passed slowly, and my sleep was constantly interrupted by strange, inexplicable noises. The sound of light footsteps on the dry leaves around the tent made me jump with fear several times. Each noise seemed closer, each child's laugh more disturbing. It was as if the island were alive, as if it were playing with me, testing my limits. The fear began to turn into panic, and all I wanted was to escape from there, but at the same time, an invisible force seemed to keep me trapped. When I finally started to drift off to sleep, I heard something that made me wake up with a start. The tent was enveloped in absolute silence, but something was there, a presence that I could clearly feel. It was as if the very air around me had become heavier, denser. I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder, a sensation so real that it made me scream and run out of the tent, stumbling over bushes as I tried to get away from that nightmare. I ran to the edge of the island, where my boat was moored, and didn't stop until I managed to get on board. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to explode. As I rowed back to the mainland, I looked back one last time. I saw the small silhouette of the island receding, and I had the strange feeling that I was being watched. The dolls, swaying gently in the wind, seemed to follow me with their empty eyes, as if they were saying goodbye, or perhaps warning me never to return. Finally, as the sun began to rise, I reached the dock. The boatman found me pale and silent. He didn't say a word as he took me back to the pier. It seemed like he already knew what I had been through. That experience changed me forever. To this day, when I talk about the island of the dolls, I feel a chill run down my spine. I know that what I experienced there was not just a figment of my tired mind. The island of the dolls is not just a place of legends. It is real, and the spirits that inhabit that place are real too. If you ever think of visiting Xochimilco and feel curious about seeing the island, I suggest you think twice. Some true horror stories are not just stories, and some dolls are not as inanimate as they seem. A guide's account at the Winchester Mystery House. The Winchester Mystery House is a mansion that's a mystery in itself. Built without any coherent plan, with staircases leading to nowhere, doors opening to solid walls, and labyrinthine hallways, the place seems designed to confuse both the living and the dead. Sarah Winchester, the widow who built it, believed she was being haunted by the spirits of those killed by the guns manufactured by her family. To appease them, she never stopped building, creating a true masterpiece of chaos. My job as a tour guide seemed simple: tell Sarah's story and lead visitors through the many strange hallways and rooms. During the day, it was easy to ignore the ghost stories and focus on the historical details. But the night tours had a different energy. The house seemed to come alive when the sun went down, and the darkness brought out a heaviness that was hard to ignore. It was during one of those night tours that my life changed forever. I was leading a group of tourists through the famous Hall of Statues, one of the most iconic and eerie areas of the mansion. The statues, with their cold expressions and empty eyes, seemed to watch every move the visitors made. As I explained the bizarre architecture and Sarah Winchester's obsession, a strange sound interrupted me, footsteps, coming from an adjacent room that was supposed to be empty. The tourists began to whisper, visibly unsettled. I tried to stay calm, explaining that the mansion, being so old, often made strange noises. But as I spoke, something unusual happened. One of the doors leading to a normally locked room started to slowly open, with no breeze or visible force to explain it. The group fell into absolute silence, all eyes fixed on the door as it moved on its own. I decided to investigate, mostly to calm the tourists' nerves and keep the situation under control. I entered the room, which was dark and empty except for the furniture covered by sheets. I turned on the light, and nothing seemed out of place, but there was a strange feeling in the air, something I couldn't immediately identify. As I turned to leave, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy footsteps, as if someone were walking right there. I quickly turned around, but there was no one. The room was empty, but the temperature had dropped drastically. I felt a chill run down my spine, something I had never experienced before. The air was dense, almost suffocating, and the feeling of being watched completely overwhelmed me. I quickly shut the door and returned to the group, trying to disguise the tremor in my voice as I continued the tour. As the tour went on, I couldn't shake that feeling. The statues seemed to follow me with their eyes, and the whispers coming from some indeterminate place grew clearer. The tourists began to notice too, exchanging worried glances and huddling closer together. It was as if the house itself was alive, trying to communicate something we didn't want to hear. When we reached the final part of the tour, in the main hall, I felt a presence behind me, something that seemed to be watching me closely. I looked around, but everything seemed normal. However, the whispers became more intense, and this time, they seemed to be coming from all directions at once. My heart raced, and I began to feel pressure in my chest, as if something invisible was trying to suffocate me. Suddenly, one of the doors in the hall slammed shut with force, even though there was no wind. The group panicked, and at that moment, I realized I needed to end the tour immediately. I led the tourists out of the house as quickly as I could, trying to stay calm, but inside, I was in pure shock. What had happened was real, something that couldn't be explained by any logic I knew. After the incident, I shared my experience with my colleagues. To my surprise, many of them had gone through similar situations but avoided talking about it. They told me the Winchester Mystery House was indeed haunted, and that the spirits inhabiting the place were old and powerful. Many guides avoided certain rooms during night tours, fearing further interactions with the supernatural. Since that night, my outlook on the world has completely changed. I'm no longer a skeptic, and now I believe there are things that simply can't be explained by science or reason. I continue working at the Winchester Mystery House, but now with a deep respect for the mysteries it holds. I avoid the darkest rooms and warn visitors about the possibility of encountering spirits, not as part of the show, but as a sincere warning. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the house, I still hear the whispers and feel the presence of those who haven't found peace. I know the mansion is more than just a monument to one woman's obsession. It's a portal to something much larger and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. If you ever visit the Winchester Mystery House, remember, the spirits inside are always watching, waiting for someone who can see and hear what they have to say. This experience taught me that some true horror stories are more real than we'd like to believe, and that places filled with suffering and pain have a way of preserving the souls that perished there. The Winchester Mystery House is one of those places, and I'll never underestimate it again. The mansion holds secrets that none of us should try to uncover, but that somehow draw us into its dark mystery, inviting us to become part of its eternal labyrinth of fear and fascination. James Ramirez's account at the Sallie House. My name is James Ramirez, and I've always been fascinated by the supernatural. Since I was young, I devoured scary stories and spent hours watching documentaries about haunted houses. When I heard about the Sallie House, a house in Atchison, Kansas, known for its intense paranormal activity, I knew I had to experience it for myself. I decided to spend a night there, to see if the legends of scratches, apparitions, and other phenomena were real. What I found was something I could never have predicted. The Sallie House has a reputation that precedes its walls. The house has been the site of numerous paranormal investigations, with reports of aggressive spirits and violent manifestations. On the night I arrived, accompanied by 3 friends who shared my interest in the supernatural, the place seemed harmless. It was a simple, ordinary-looking house, but it was heavy with an invisible weight, a feeling that something wasn't right. As soon as we entered, we were overcome by a sense of unease, as if we were being watched. Armed with cameras, audio recorders, and other monitoring devices, we began our exploration. The first few hours were relatively calm. We walked through the rooms, feeling the air thick and dense, but without any obvious manifestations. However, as the night wore on, something began to change. Around midnight, while we were in the living room, I felt a sudden chill in the air. It was a strange cold that didn't match the ambient temperature, like a wave of ice materializing out of nowhere. Shortly after, a burning sensation started to form on my left arm. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks due to the house's charged atmosphere. However, the discomfort quickly turned into pain. When I looked at my arm, I was shocked to see 3 long, deep scratches forming on my skin, right before my eyes. There was nothing around me that could have caused that, and the pain was so intense that I almost screamed. The scratches were arranged in a linear pattern, as if 3 invisible claws had dug into my flesh, and I immediately remembered the true horror stories associated with the Sallie House. My friends, who were in the same room, were equally horrified to see the scratches appear out of nowhere. One of them tried to capture the moment with his camera, but we soon realized something even more disturbing. Our recording devices began to fail suddenly. The batteries, which were fully charged, drained within seconds, and the audio recorders picked up only static, as if some invisible force was sabotaging our equipment. The pain and burning sensation continued for several minutes. It was as if something was deliberately trying to hurt me, an invisible force scratching my skin with malicious intent. There was no logical explanation for what was happening, and the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. When the scratches finally stopped forming, the marks were visible and remained on my arm for the rest of the night, a tangible reminder of the horror we experienced. Terrified, I decided I wouldn't spend another moment alone in that house. We gathered the whole group in the living room and tried to stay calm, but the tension was palpable. The walls seemed to close in around us, and the environment became suffocating. As we tried to make sense of what had happened, we heard inexplicable noises, footsteps coming from upstairs, doors creaking, as if someone, or something, was moving through the house, even though we were all gathered in the same place. The night dragged on endlessly. Every sound, every shadow, seemed to carry a threat, as if the house itself was alive and aware of our presence. We tried to distract ourselves by talking, but our voices were swallowed by the oppressive silence that dominated the Sallie House. I couldn't take my eyes off the scratches on my arm, a physical proof that something was deeply wrong in that place. The early morning hours were pure torment. None of us could sleep, and with every noise, our hearts raced. The fear was almost tangible, like an invisible entity hovering over us. I started to feel a pressure in my chest, a growing anguish that seemed to suffocate any attempt at reasoning. It was as if the house was testing us, playing with our nerves, keeping us on the edge of despair. When the first rays of sunlight finally began to light up the horizon, we were all exhausted, both physically and mentally. We decided we had spent enough time in the Sally house and that it was time to leave. The relief of leaving that place was immediate, but what we experienced there remained etched in our memories. We knew we had encountered something inexplicable, something that defied all logic. When I got home, I shared photos of the scratches on social media and told my story in paranormal forums. The reactions were mixed, some believed it, others doubted. But for me, there was no doubt anymore. Something truly sinister inhabits the Sally house. The marks on my arm were undeniable proof that the terrifying true stories about that place were real. I swore I would never go back. Today, when people ask me about the Sally house, I warn them, be careful what you wish to find. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some houses hold secrets that no one should try to uncover. My night in the Sally house was a terrifying reminder that the world is much stranger and scarier than any of us can imagine. An employee's account at Myrtle's plantation. My name is Michael, and I've always considered myself a skeptic. I grew up hearing scary stories, but to me, those stories were just tales, something to entertain, nothing more. When I started working as a tour guide at Myrtle's plantation, in the heart of Louisiana, I never imagined that my views on the supernatural would change so drastically. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story, but a real experience that deeply marked me and changed my life forever. Myrtle's plantation is famous for its legends and ghost stories. From the moment I started working there, I heard whispers about apparitions and paranormal activities. One name, in particular, kept coming up in conversations: Chloe. She was a slave who, according to legend, poisoned the plantation owner's family, causing a tragedy that supposedly left her soul trapped in that house. I always treated these stories with skepticism, but one event, in particular, made me reconsider everything. It was a hot summer afternoon, and I was leading a group of tourists through the house, as I did every day. The heat was oppressive, but inside the house, the temperature seemed to drop suddenly as we climbed to the second floor. We reached the hallway leading to the room where Chloe was said to have committed the poisoning. Suddenly, I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine. It was as if the air around us had transformed, becoming dense and cold. I continued telling Chloe's story, trying to ignore the strange feeling that was taking hold of me. Then I noticed that some tourists were looking back, toward the hallway we had just come from. A woman, with a pale face, interrupted me and said she had seen a figure of a woman standing at the end of the hallway. She described her as someone dressed in old-fashioned clothes, with a headscarf, the perfect description of Chloe. I tried to stay calm, but my voice wavered as I suggested it might just be her imagination. However, when two other tourists confirmed they had seen the same figure, I felt my heart race. Curiosity and a sense of duty as a guide pushed me to check the hallway. As I approached, my whole body was tense. And then, right in front of everyone, the figure vanished, as if it had never been there. The group fell silent, visibly shaken. I, who had always been the skeptic, felt disoriented, unable to explain what had just happened. The tour continued, but the atmosphere was different. There was tension in the air, something I couldn't shake. And that night, as I closed up, things got even stranger. After the tour, I shared the experience with some colleagues. To my surprise, they weren't surprised. Many of them had seen Chloe in different parts of the house, especially near the room where the tragedy occurred. I began to realize that my experience wasn't unique. Everyone there had their own true horror stories to tell, and the house seemed to be alive with an energy we couldn't understand. That night, I was the last to leave, responsible for closing the house. As I walked through the empty corridors, turning off the lights and locking the doors, I began to hear whispers. They were faint voices, almost indistinguishable, but clearly feminine. I stopped several times to try to locate where they were coming from, but the whispers seemed to follow me, moving from one room to another. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Every step I took seemed to echo back at me, mixed with the whispers. The fear began to settle in, something I had never felt so intensely. It was as if the house was trying to tell me something, as if Chloe was there, trying to communicate in some way. I quickened my pace, trying to finish my task as quickly as possible. But the scariest incident was yet to come. When I was finally descending the stairs to leave the house, I felt a light touch on my shoulder. It felt like someone had placed a hand there, gently, but firmly. My heart stopped for a second. I turned quickly, expecting to see a colleague, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, but the touch was so real that I was paralyzed, unable to move for a few seconds. The reality of what had happened began to sink into my mind. That touch, that inexplicable cold, the whispers. It wasn't my imagination. Something, or someone, was definitely there. After that incident, my skepticism was completely shattered. I began to believe that Chloe really still roamed Myrtle's plantation, trapped by the tragedies of her past. From that day on, I avoided working alone in the house at night. The idea of being there, in that oppressive silence, surrounded by memories and the spirits of the past, was something I couldn't bear anymore. I started looking for another job, feeling that the experiences I had at Myrtle's plantation were more than I was prepared to handle. That house had left a mark on me, a permanent reminder that the world we know is just a part of a much larger and scarier reality. Eventually, I left the job, but the memories never left me. To this day, when I talk about Myrtle's plantation, I feel a chill run down my spine. I know there's something there, something that defies any logical explanation. And that's why I say, if you decide to visit Myrtle's plantation, be prepared. The house has a way of revealing secrets we'd rather not know, and the true horror stories we hear might be more real than we could ever imagine. Now, when someone asks me about ghosts, I'm no longer the skeptic I once was. I experienced something I can't explain, something beyond words. And to those who seek answers, I suggest caution. Sometimes, the answers we find are more disturbing than the questions we have. A couple's account of the Stanley Hotel. My name is Emma, and I've never been a particularly superstitious person. I've always been drawn to scary stories, but I saw them as just entertainment, something to watch on a rainy night or read before bed. When my husband, Jack, suggested we spend a weekend at the Stanley Hotel in Colorado, I admit I was excited. The hotel, famous for inspiring Stephen King to write The Shining, had a sinister reputation, especially room 217, where King stayed. We decided it would be fun to spend the night there, imagining that, at most, we'd have an interesting story to tell our friends. We arrived at the Stanley Hotel on a Friday afternoon, and the place was impressive. A grand structure surrounded by mountains, it seemed frozen in time. The air of mystery was palpable from the moment we stepped into the lobby. The classic decor, wide hallways, and antique chandeliers gave the sense that we were stepping into another era. But nothing could have prepared us for what was to come. After a long day of exploring the hotel and the surrounding area, we returned to room 217, excited to finally rest. The room was comfortable, decorated in a traditional style with a touch of luxury we hadn't expected. We left our suitcases open, clothes spread out over the chairs and bed, planning to organize everything the next day. After a relaxing shower, we turned off the lights and got ready for bed, laughing at the idea that anything supernatural could really happen. The night passed quietly, without any unusual events, or so we thought. When we woke up the next morning, something was different. Jack was the first to notice. All of our clothes, which had been scattered around the room, had been folded and meticulously organized. The suitcases we'd left open were now closed, with the zippers pulled all the way up. I was in shock, trying to understand what had happened. Our first thought was that a hotel staff member had entered the room while we were sleeping. But that seemed unlikely and, frankly, disturbing. We went down to the reception to ask if anyone had entered our room during the night. The answer we received only increased our discomfort. The staff assured us that no one had accessed room 217, and that it was against hotel policy for any staff to enter occupied rooms without the guest's permission, especially during the night. Jack tried to rationalize what had happened, suggesting that maybe one of us had done it unconsciously, but we both knew that explanation didn't make sense. The most disturbing part was the fact that the clothes were folded in a way neither of us normally would. Each piece was organized with almost military precision, something that simply didn't match how we usually left our things. Still trying to process what had happened, we decided not to let it ruin our weekend. We spent the day exploring the area, trying to push the mystery of the previous night out of our minds. But the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't go away. I started to feel like I was being watched, as if there was an invisible presence around us, something I couldn't explain. That night, we returned to room 217, both silent, each lost in our own thoughts. I lay down on the bed, trying to ignore the growing sense of discomfort. Jack fell asleep quickly, but I couldn't manage to fall asleep. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up with a strange sensation. I was lying on my side, and I clearly felt the mattress sink, as if someone had sat on the edge of the bed. I thought it was Jack, but when I turned, I saw he was sleeping soundly beside me. Fear gripped me. The feeling that someone was there, smoothing the blanket, was so strong that I turned on the light. I looked around the room, but of course, there was no one. The room was empty except for the two of us, but the feeling of a presence was undeniable, almost suffocating. From that moment on, the atmosphere in the room changed drastically. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't identify. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling, trying to rationalize what I had felt. But the truth was, I couldn't find any logical explanation. There was something in room 217, something not of this world, and I was terrified. When the sun finally started to rise, I woke Jack and told him I didn't want to spend another night there. He didn't argue. In fact, he seemed just as uncomfortable as I was. We quickly packed our things and went downstairs to check out. At the reception, the clerk asked if we had enjoyed our stay, and I just muttered that it was an unforgettable experience, but not in the way we had expected. While we waited for our car, I spoke with a staff member who, noticing our discomfort, asked if something had happened. I briefly told her what we had experienced, and she just nodded, as if she had heard similar stories before. Before we left, she said something that still sends chills down my spine. Many say that room 217 has a special energy. Not everyone can handle it. We returned home with a story we would undoubtedly tell for a long time, but one that left a permanent mark on our lives. To this day, when I think about that night, I feel a chill run down my spine. The Stanley Hotel is much more than a historic place. It's a portal to something unknown, something that's beyond our understanding. Another account from room 217. I was on a business trip when I decided to stay at the Stanley Hotel in Colorado. I had heard about the place's reputation, especially room 217, known for its strange and scary stories. Although I'm not the type of person who gets easily spooked by these things, the idea of spending a night in such a famous place for its mysteries seemed intriguing. After all, a little dose of excitement never hurts, right? I arrived at the hotel at dusk, and the place was as majestic as I had imagined. The classic architecture, the historic ambience, it all looked like something out of an old movie. I was greeted by friendly staff who handed me the key to my room with a polite smile. As I made my way up to room 217, I felt a slight shiver as I put the key in the lock, but I brushed it off, convinced it was just excitement mixed with a bit of nervousness. The room was cozy and elegant, with period furniture that seemed to tell stories from a distant past. I placed my bags on the bed and began unpacking, spreading some clothes over the chairs and dresser. I was tired from the trip, so I decided to take a relaxing shower and then go to bed. During the shower, I had a slight feeling that someone was watching me, but I ignored it. It was an old house, full of history. It was natural to feel a little nervous. After the shower, I got dressed and lay down. The day's exhaustion began to weigh on me, and I soon fell into a deep sleep. However, I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling a presence in the room. I slowly opened my eyes, and to my amazement, I saw a female figure at the foot of the bed. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, something that seemed to be from the 19th century, perhaps a housekeeper. She moved gently, as if she were arranging something in the air, folding invisible clothes with almost hypnotic concentration. I was paralyzed. I didn't know if I was dreaming or awake, but the figure was so real that I could see the fabric of her dress move as she worked. For a moment, I thought about screaming, but something stopped me. The figure didn't seem threatening, but there was a coldness in her presence that made the fear inside me grow. I blinked, trying to shake off the vision, and when I opened my eyes again, she was gone. The room was empty, but the sensation that someone had been there persisted. My heart was racing, and I felt cold sweat dripping down my forehead. I sat up in bed, trying to process what had just happened. Could my mind have been playing tricks on me? Maybe it was the fatigue mixed with the stories I already knew about the hotel. I decided I needed to calm down, so I turned on the bedside lamp and went to the bathroom to wash my face. When I returned, I noticed something that made me freeze in place. All the clothes I had left scattered around the room were now meticulously folded on a chair next to the bed. Each piece of clothing was organized with a care I certainly hadn't taken when I unpacked. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation. Could I have folded the clothes before bed and forgotten? But I knew that wasn't the case. I clearly remembered leaving them in disarray. The fear turned into a nearly tangible dread. It wasn't possible that someone had entered the room while I was sleeping. I checked the door, which was locked from the inside, and the windows were closed as well. There was no sign that anyone else had been there, but the invisible presence I had felt earlier seemed stronger now, as if it was watching me, waiting to see how I would react. I couldn't go back to sleep after that. I sat in bed with the lights on, trying to make sense of what had happened. With every passing minute, the desire to leave that room grew stronger. What had once been a fun curiosity about the supernatural had now turned into a nightmare from which I desperately wanted to wake up. I began to question whether all of it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. Finally, when the sun began to rise, I made the decision to leave the hotel as soon as possible. I hurriedly packed my things, trying not to look at the chair where the clothes were folded. I went down to the reception and asked to check out early. The clerk looked at me curiously but didn't ask any questions. It seemed like he had seen this before. As I left the hotel, I felt an immediate sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The distance from room 217 was comforting, but what happened that night never left my mind. I tried to rationalize the experience, looking for logical explanations, but deep down, I knew that what I had seen and felt wasn't a product of my imagination. Something, or someone, was in that room, and I had been an unwilling witness. After that day, I never looked at ghost stories the same way again. What happened at the Stanley Hotel wasn't just a scary story to tell but an experience that left a mark on me. Today, whenever I think about taking a trip, I make sure to choose places with no reputation for being haunted. Some experiences, as I've learned, are better left avoided. If you ever think about spending the night in room 217 of the Stanley Hotel, I suggest you think twice. What happened to me could happen to you, and we're not always prepared for what the inexplicable has in store. The line between the real and the supernatural may be much thinner than we imagine. The courtroom experience at the Whaley House. My name is Nathan, and I've always been a skeptic about the supernatural. I grew up hearing scary stories, but I never let them get to me. However, my curiosity always drew me to places that carry these legends, and that's how I ended up at the Whaley House in San Diego. The house, famous for being one of the most haunted places in the United States, piqued my interest. I decided to join one of the night tours, thinking it would just be another experience to share with friends. I arrived at the Whaley House at dusk. The house, with its Victorian architecture and history marked by tragedies, exuded a heavy atmosphere. The group of tourists gathered in the lobby, where the guide began telling the house's stories. The place was old, with wooden floors that creaked underfoot and walls that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. Something in the air felt different, as if the house were alive, watching each one of us. Right at the start of the tour, we were led to the old courtroom, one of the areas most known for its paranormal activity. As we entered the room, I felt a chill run down my spine. The air was thicker, almost suffocating. As the guide talked about the trials that took place there, I began to feel a light touch on my shoulder, as if someone were trying to get my attention. I turned to see who was behind me, but there was no one. The discomfort grew when I realized that no one else seemed to notice the touch. My eyes searched for some logical explanation, but the room was almost empty, except for the other tourists who, like me, were focused on the guide's stories. He, noticing my unease, casually mentioned that many people reported strange sensations in that room. Inexplicable touches are common here, he said, as if it were routine. Despite the explanation, the sensation of being touched continued. With every step I took, it felt like someone was beside me, invisible, but present. It was a disturbing feeling, as if the house were playing with me, testing my limits. Even so, I stayed with the group, trying to ignore the growing discomfort. It was when we went upstairs that things got really strange. As we explored the Whaley family's bedrooms, I stopped in front of Thomas Whaley's room, the family patriarch. The guide was talking about Thomas's life and how he had invested everything in that house, only to be haunted by the tragedies that followed. That's when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a male figure standing in the doorway of the room. He was tall, wearing old-fashioned clothes that seemed to date back to the 19th century. The sight was so clear that, for a moment, I thought it was someone from the group trying to play a prank. But when I turned my head to look directly, the figure simply vanished. My heart raced, and a wave of fear washed over me. It was as if the man had been watching me, with a serious, perhaps even disapproving, expression. At that moment, I felt that there was something more there, something that didn't belong to our world. Shaken, I mentioned what I saw to the guide, expecting him to say I was just imagining things. But to my surprise, he confirmed that other visitors had also reported seeing a similar figure in that exact spot. Many believe it's the spirit of Thomas Whaley, he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. His words only heightened my discomfort. From that moment on, I felt a constant presence beside me. It didn't matter where I looked, I felt as if I was being watched. The air around me felt heavy, and every step I took made me feel as if I was treading on forbidden ground. Although nothing as vivid as the sight of the man happened again, the feeling of being accompanied by something invisible was undeniable. The tour continued, but I could hardly pay attention. My mind was fixated on what I had seen and felt. I began to question whether it had all been real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. However, every time I tried to rationalize what had happened, the fear returned, bringing with it the certainty that I had witnessed something beyond comprehension. When we finally left the house, the relief was immediate. The cool night air had never felt so welcoming. However, even outside the house, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It was as if something from the house had attached itself to me, refusing to let me go. As I got into the car, I turned back one last time to look at the house, and I swear I saw a shadow in the window of Thomas's room, as if someone was watching me leave. Since that night, I can no longer ignore the existence of the supernatural. The Whaley House changed my perception in ways I never imagined. What was supposed to be just a curious visit turned into an experience that I carry with me to this day. There's no way to rationally explain what I experienced in that house, but I know that what happened was real, just as real as the ground I stand on. Today, when I hear someone talk about the Whaley House, I'm the first to say, be careful. The true horror stories surrounding that place aren't just legends or made-up tales to attract tourists. They're experiences lived by people who, like me, came face to face with the unexplainable. The Whaley House is more than a piece of history. It's a portal to something much bigger, something that challenges our understanding of the world. So, if you decide to visit the Whaley House, be prepared. Be ready to feel the weight of the past and the presence of those who haven't found peace. And remember, some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. If you enjoyed this true horror story, you can't miss the 8 True Disturbing Horror Stories compilation to watch. Click the video here on the card or look for the video before this one on the channel. And, of course, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience too. Stay brave, and see you in the next scary story.